Okay, so today we start aggregate demand and aggregate supply, kind of our final market to the big market model that we started. A few weeks ago, probably 4 weeks ago, I told you where this class was headed. We're trying to get our arms around the macro economy. The study of economics is looking at scarce resources and how we allocate those to the final goods and services that we actually want. And we started off in the labor market, labor supply and labor demand, and talked about the resource labor. And we learned about the real wage and how much people decide to work. Then we looked at the loanable funds market because there was a close link between the amount of borrowing going on in the marketplace and the amount of money that's going towards capital, physical things usually that help make man-made things that help make other things. So this was our capital bucket, and so we measured the quantity of funds, and that brought into play interest rates, specifically the real rate of interest. Money helps facilitate the economy, helps facilitate trade. I like to think of it as the oil to the engine. And so the money market looks at the price of money, the nominal interest rate, and the quantity of money in the system. The quantity of money is determined by the Federal Reserve. How much money is actually floating around out there is a choice variable at the discretion of the Fed, as we learned. And the demand for money comes from businesses and households, people that are using those funds for transactions, primarily. Then kind of the granddaddy of them all, I mean, really the whole course, some other textbooks start with this model that we're going to get into now, because it's really talking about the biggies that we addressed in chapter 4, the very first chapter that I considered kind of the macro chapter. And so this last one's an important model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we're going to be measuring the price level on the vertical axis, the average level of prices. Prices of what? Prices of everything on average. The average level of prices of everything in the economy. What's everything? What's our Q? Real GDP. Price and quantity. So at the micro level, we've got the price of beer and the quantity of beer. At the macro level, we've got the average level of all goods and services and the dollar value of all final goods and services measured here in the United States within a country's boundaries. So that's where we're going. We're going to start off with supply. What is the aggregate supply? Aggregate supply. What did Chapter 2's Production Possibilities Frontier teach us? The old PPF. I like to come back to that. We started off with Tom and Jen on the island, coconuts and fish. What did the Production Possibilities Frontier teach us? We can't gain more of one good without giving up some of the other, right? So that frontier that we created for Tom and Jen, if we had enough information, we'd expect it to be bowed outward from the origin. And if we had coconuts and fish, it shows the maximum potential for the economy. As Katie pointed out, we can't have more of one good without giving up some of the other. In other words, if you're here at point A and you'd like to have more fish, you have to give up some coconuts. You have no choice because you were efficient, you were productively efficient at point A, And now you want to get to point B. The only way you can do it is to give up some. So this represents the maximum levels of production. We could be anywhere along there, but it represents some sort of boundary that we really can't go outside of, right? One of the early lessons was, what's true about a point out here? Well, it's impossible. Given the resources and technology that we have today, you can't get to that point. How do you get to that point over time? Economic growth. So more resources. If there's an increase in capital accumulation, Chapter 6, long-term economic growth. If we invest in capital of all forms, possibly human capital through education. So if we continue to get more and more capital, human capital and physical capital, we can potentially get out to that point, but we can't get there right now without additional resources or technology. And that indeed was exactly what economic growth was. So now I'm dealing in this space. What does that mean then if we think about the ideas here of only having so much stuff on our island, some amount of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship at any given point in time, we can only make so much stuff. That creates an upper limit moving along the horizontal axis. So if we're going from 100 to 200 to 300 to 400 to 500, can we just choose to keep supplying more and more and more and more? No. We're going to run out of resources eventually. So the same thing holds in this graph in the long run. The supply of goods and services can only be so much. And it doesn't constraint on the connection between using resources to make things. And so we can only be so far. And so that so far is somewhere. And that is going to be the potential for the economy. So I'm going to use the notation large Y, which we've used for income. Remember, income equals spending, income equals real GDP. Subscript P for potential. So this is the potential for the economy. And that amount of gross domestic product is truly independent of prices. We couldn't get more if we tried. And so the aggregate supply curve is vertical. In other words, it doesn't matter if the price level is 100, 110, 200, 210. Doesn't matter where we are for prices. That is it. You just can't have any more. Okay. So this is what we're going to call the long run aggregate supply curve. So long run aggregate supply, LAS. The long run aggregate supply curve shows the economies potential level of output. Given full employment of resources. Now, I snuck in a word here, full employment. What did that mean? Back to chapter 6, I guess. Full employment. I put full employment of resources, but we use that word full employment in regard to labor. The natural rate of unemployment. Yeah, that was that connection saying that if all of our resources are fully employed, there's still going to be some unemployment, and that is the full employment rate. So in other words, we're using all of our resources kind of at their long-run potential here. Full employment. One of the key points is that this potential level of output that I identified on the graph is y subscript p superscript star asterisk. The potential level of output is independent of the price level. Now that's a little bit weird too. I want to make sure we flesh out the weirdness. The reason that holds is that if the price level's going up, all prices are going up. Resource prices and output prices. That's the key to that statement. So it kind of goes back to our labor market when if I told you that, hey, all the prices of the stuff on the shelves at Walmart's going to double tomorrow, but I'm going to give you twice as much money to go to the store to use, are you any worse off? No, your purchasing power is the same. So if you had $100 in your wallet to go buy stuff at Walmart at the given prices today, you'd be able to buy a certain amount of stuff. And if tomorrow I said every price on the shelf is going to double, but I'm going to give you $200 today, you're not going to sweat it. You're going to be able to go into the store and get the exact same quantities that you could before when you walk out of the store. So your real wage was maintained constant. Your purchasing power was constant. And that's what this is saying here, is that the potential level of real GDP is independent of prices. Because if they're all going up together, it doesn't matter. So in the long run, resource prices and output prices move together. Such that the purchasing power is constant. Since, remember, we are talking about real GDP, which is also income. Somebody's spending is the other person's income. That's kind of what this is playing on. So, for example, a 100% increase in prices at Walmart don't matter if your income also went up by 100%. This is a super important point because we're going to deviate from it in a moment. So I want to make sure we're all tracking on that. Okay, so let's introduce some shifters since we're so close anyway here now. What are things that are going to make this thing creep to the right? What's going to make it move and start drifting over time this way? More resources. So one a change in resources, more generically. So an increase in labor will lead to an increase in the long-run aggregate supply, a shift to the right now. An increase in machines, capital, will lead to an increase in long-run aggregate supply. I don't need to put the double thumb down, a shift to the right. So same things we saw in chapter 6. Could be human capital for that matter. So maybe an increase in human capital. People, more education. I'll put K, I don't think we ever did HK, a different sign for that. But human capital would also lead to long-term economic growth. All the chapter 6 material. What else? There's one more. So resource base, increase in resources will change it. What else? Technology. A change in technology. That new invention, that new discovery, a more efficient way to put things together. So we can't really think about technology moving the other direction very easily. So an increase in technology, more technology leads to an increase in long-run aggregate supply. Some industries might die because of it, but those resources will be reallocated into some other activity in the long run, causing more production ultimately, a higher level of income. Okay. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense from our supply curve. In micro class, oh, by the way, I wanted to make one more connection here. This is the same thing we memorized for test number 1. Shifts of the production possibilities frontier is this list. So we might just add that little note here. Note, same as PPF shifters. Because I do want you to keep those two models in mind as we work through some of this. It's helpful. Okay, so question for you. How can the average firm, or most firms, have an upward sloping supply curve? So let's put a big but up here. But in micro, which I know some of you haven't had micro, but we did do this in chapter 15 with the supply curve we use. But in micro, the supply curve looked like this. And so let me pick on the beer companies for a while. If this is Budweiser or beer, the supply curve looked like this. As the price of beer went up, then Bud was willing to supply more to the market. Not only Budweiser, but lawyers and dentists and orthodontists. My son's getting into braces here, so ortho is kind of on my mind. Not exactly cheap money there, as you guys might know. So all of these producers, or most of these producers, have a supply curve that looks like this. How then could we argue that at the end of the day it all washes out to look like this? Right? Imagine that every supply curve, all of the goods that are on the shelves at Walmart, their supply curve is upward sloping, which means a higher price. If the price of the 12-pack goes from $12 to $14, then Bud is more than happy to supply 20 cases more. The quantity supplied jumps up from Q1 to Q2. We move from point A to point B. So, those of you who had micro what were some of the things that we were holding constant, i.e. those things that will actually shift this thing, when we created this relationship, this positive relationship between the price of bud going up and the quantity supplied going up. Price of resources. So we didn't allow the employees to get a bump in pay at the same time. So for instance, the wage of our employees at Budweiser, let's say Budweiser's a pretty good employer and they're paying 20 bucks an hour on average. Along this supply curve, we're going to hold the $20 per hour price constant at 20. Now, if I was to play some games and say, well, what would be the quantity supplied if the wages went up to $30 an hour? What would happen? So at $14, Budweiser used to supply 120. Now are they going to supply more or less when the wages they're paying are $30? Less, right? Hypothetically speaking, at $12 an hour for Budweiser, they used to supply 100 cases of Bud when wages were 20. Now that they're supplying, or now that wages have gone up to 30, are they going to supply more or less? Less, right? And so this whole thing shifts to the left when wages are allowed to float up. And this brings me back to why this thing had this shape in the first place. Yes, all individual firms may have this, but it's because resource prices were held constant when we altered the price. Which means we can have the same thing going on in this picture using that exact same assumption. So we're going to have a separation between the short-run supply and the long-run supply. The short-run supply curve, the SAS, could be upward sloping if we make this same assumption. Short-run aggregate supply. I'll write it out and define it in a moment. Short-run aggregate supply. So short-run versus long-run. Before I do, though, let's think about this if it feels right with your gut. So if you're a business like a grocery store or Walmart or Target or whoever you want to be, as the economy's changing and it starts to slump, what do you do in response to that? What's your gut reaction? How do you behave as a producer when the economy starts to slow down but you don't know it? Remember we talked about lag times, that we might not know the economy's going into recession until 6 months down the road. So you as a private business owner, all you kind of feel is, hey, business is off a little bit. Geez, we got kind of a big inventory. What do you tend to do when you have excess inventory on the shelves? Drop the price, right? So do you drop your wages of your employees right away in response to that too because business fell off? No, you're not going to be a very good employer. You're not going to have a lot of happy employees if you start saying, hey, listen, this is the way our business works. If business falls off, you're going to get a cut in pay. But on the good side, if business is up, you're going to get a bump in pay. Employees tend not to like that type of situation. They like a little more consistency. So when business starts to fall off, prices tend to adjust first. Now, will Walmart, Target, grocery store, whatever image you have in your mind, does that mean they'll never cut wages? No. If that recession persists, what are they going to tend to do if the slump tends to continue in their business? Whether it's due to them, by the way, or whether it's due to the overall economy, they don't know. They just know that business is off. Maybe there was a new competitor that opened up a big store across the street. You know, there could be a large number of things going on. But eventually, what are they going to do with their employees? Fire them? layoff, wage freeze, right? A wage freeze, cut and pay. So employers sometimes that come to their employees and say, hey, listen, I know business is off, I really value your services, but we have to have a 5% pay cut to stay competitive with blah, 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 right? And they make some story for whatever reason. But eventually those wages could start to be affected as well. And that's kind of the heart of our story here, and the difference between short run and long run adjustments is that in the short run, it seems fairly reasonable to say that prices could be sticky. Resource prices could be sticky. All right, so let's write some of that stuff out. We'll start off with the definition here. Short run aggregate supply. SAS. Short run aggregate supply. So short run aggregate supply shows a possible positive relationship between higher price level and higher real GDP. Given that resource prices and technology are unchanged. So note, this is the same assumption used in the micro supply curve. Which is the little example that we just went through. The key point is that it seems reasonable that there may be a lag between output and resource price adjustment. The story would be that output prices adjust first, resource prices lag behind. So output prices adjust first, resource price adjustment lags behind. Now, right now, you guys are naive to the can of worms we just opened. that is the heart of the macroeconomic debate for the last 60 plus years, probably. We can go back to Keynes. How quickly does that happen? Do resource prices lag a little bit behind or a long ways behind? So this is the heart of the argument and disagreement among economists in macroeconomics. So this is my double key, the key point. The length of the lag is at the heart of macroeconomic debate. So different theories about lag times exist and will be explored the rest of the course. Yeah, so output prices, I'm glad you brought that up. We use a lot of different words interchangeably. So output prices is the prices of final goods and services. The prices of final goods and services. The stuff that's ultimately the price paid by the consumer. That's the output. If we think back to this picture, we've got our bucket of resource prices, that those resources are physically used to make stuff. That physical process highlights the long run aggregate supply curve. We can only have so much. There's choices to make on how much we do. And the prices of the outputs are the prices of this stuff. The prices of the inputs are the prices of the resource prices, are what's being held constant along this short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. Should have probably left that one. So, shifters. We kind of already did them. I want to make sure they're crystal clear here. Okay, so short run aggregate supply shifters. So number one is a change in resources. A change in resources. In other words, this is the same as the long run aggregate supply curve. So an increase in labor leads to an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve. A shift to the right. Now I want to take the time here to draw both curves, because there's a little bit of mechanics that I want to make sure we're clear on. So just draw a short run aggregate supply curve and a long run aggregate supply curve. Now, as a reminder that along this short run aggregate supply curve, nominal resource prices are held fixed, I'm just going to use a big W, which we used in chapter 6 when we talked about wages. Let's just say that the wages are constant at $10 an hour. If there's an increase in labor, the quantity of labor, holding all other things constant, then if this intersection happens to be at a price level of 100, just making up a number now. Remember, that's our base year. It's always equal to 100, but I'm just using 100 for simplicity. The change in resources is going to bump up not only our short run, but our long run aggregate supply curve. And this is how you'd show that. So our potential would move to, let's call it P2. Let's call this P1. And I want you to draw it like this. So long run aggregate supply curve would move to the right, to that level. And the short run aggregate supply curve would move to that level. Notice that we haven't touched nominal wages. They're still $10. We just had a change in the resource base. But this whole thing would kind of move in harmony together on a change in resources. Questions on that at all? Kind of the mechanics of the graph. Number 2 on our supply shifter list is a change in technology. Once again, same thing, same type of idea is going to go on here. An increase in technology leads to a shift to the right of the short run aggregate supply curve. And it's going to look just like, looks like that. Same thing. All right, the last one's the big one. The third shifter, which remember we stopped at 2 shifters, even though it could be any of these resources in here. The third one is a change in resource prices. Well, I'm isolating it just down to short run aggregate supply. So now I'm going to free that up. And it's going to be something that'll shift the short run aggregate supply curve. So a change in resource prices. If there's an increase in wages, for instance, another thing I should have probably put in before already, but these are nominal resource prices, not real. So it's big W. In other words, it's not this. How did we derive the real wage? Coming back to chapter 6 for a moment. Nominal over the price level. Big W over the price level. That's where we went through those examples of if I'm making $30 an hour, but the price level is 112, the real wage is 30 divided by 1.12, right? So we're talking about big W over here now. If there's an increase in nominal resource prices, that's going to lead to a decrease in short run aggregate supply, a shift to the left. Now this one I do want to graph out. So if we have nominal wages at $10, here's kind of the same situation we were drawing before, but now we're going to have resource prices go up from, let's say, $10 to $15. Pretty big jump in wages. The short run aggregate supply curve at $15 lies to the left of where it was. But that in and of itself doesn't change our long run potential. Okay. Questions or comments on that?
Why doesn't it change the potential?
What's that?
Why doesn't it change the potential?
Because we're only dealing with prices. So in the long run, we've got conceptually just be thinking of a physical amount of resources. I can only physically make so much stuff, is the way I like to think about that. All right. So our last participant into the market is aggregate demand. So AD, aggregate demand. Now, with the aggregate demand curve, we want to be thinking about all the people who potentially are buying crap down here. Who does that include? Who's buying all this stuff, the demand curve, so to speak? Who's buying the stuff? Consumers, yes. Businesses, and government. All of them are buyers, right? We go back to cigarettes, C plus I plus G plus X. All of them compose real gross domestic product. And we could throw foreigners in there for that matter too. So with aggregate demand, our players, so to speak, our players in the market is everybody we've come to know and love here. We've got consumers or households more generally. If we think back to our circular flow diagram, we got households, businesses, governments, and row, the rest of the world. In fact, it's kind of helpful to think back to our expenditure approach to measuring real GDP. Real GDP can be broken down into those players' parts, their fraction of GDP that they make up. C plus I plus G plus X. Where we've got primarily consumers, primarily businesses buying machines and equipment, government buying weapons of mass destruction, and the rest of the world, imports and exports. Us buying from other places around the world, them buying from us. So all the players in the market kind of boil down to that. And so now here what we're going to do is kind of make a little bit of a switch, kind of a little sleight of hand by the economists maybe. And we're simply going to say, well, we can imagine then the demand by each one of those people, which is then going to be basically the same thing. The aggregate demand for the economy comes about from these four agents. That demand curve looks very similar to the demand curve we would see in microeconomics. Holding all other things constant, as prices tend to fall, people are willing and able to buy more stuff. There's a wealth effect that the purchasing power of their wealth goes up. They can afford to buy more things if prices are cheaper on average. So that's on the consumption side. We've got government kind of behaving potentially a similar way, although they can be on a different objective. And the rest of the world, when our prices are cheap relative to the rest of the world, they'll tend to buy more stuff from us. So that's where we'll pick up next time, building on aggregate demand and aggregate supply.